Hello, welcome to Net Diligence Cyber Risk Virtual Summit. My name is Heather Osborne. I'm the Director of Global Events and Programming here at Net Diligence, a cyber risk assessment and data breach services company. Net Diligence is pleased to present Leaders Needed, Preventing the Next Big Breach. Our speaker today is Jamil Farshchi, the CISO for Equifax. This program has been underwritten by Equifax today, and we thank them for this support. For today's webinar, we will be using the On24 platform, and you should be viewing the On24 dashboard in your live screen. All participants will be in listen mode only. Today's presentation will last for approximately 20 minutes, with extensive live Q&A to follow. Jamil will be taking questions throughout the session via the Questions widget. Please type in questions during the presentation and click Submit. Once the presentation concludes, we will roll to live Q&A. I look forward to rejoining you after his presentation for questions. You can also find a widget called Resources, where you can download assets our presenters and sponsors have provided. Just click on the resource and it will be automatically downloaded. If you are seeking CLE credit for today's webcast, please navigate to the CLE box in the lower right-hand corner to make your selection. This will ensure that you are emailed the CLE questionnaire to complete your application for credit. Additionally, please note that you must remain online for the duration of the program and answer the 3 polling questions that appear during the presentation. I hope you all enjoy today's program. Thank you, Jamil. I'll hand the mic over to you.
I want to talk about trust, and then we're going to go through some of the experiences that I've had throughout my career. To start off, I want to talk about a day that I'll not ever forget, and that day was September 7th, 2017. Started off like any other normal day, but it wasn't long after I got into the office that morning that I got a phone call from my CEO. Not something you always want to get. And he immediately started grilling me on a variety of things. How many records? What's the data sensitivity? Do we have any interconnections? What are the risks that we have? And as a CISO, you never really want to get that phone call. And then that led to the next set of discussions with the board members, asking the same types of questions. The team running all around the place, trying to get as many answers as they could. It was a very chaotic and crazy time. But what you may not realize is that I wasn't at Equifax at the time. I was at the company with the big orange sign, the Mecca for do-it-yourselfers. I was at Home Depot. And as a customer, the Equifax breach caused us a lot of pain. From a customer's perspective, my level of trust in that organization was meaningfully impacted, as was that of all of the other employees, the board directors, and so forth throughout the organization. But it wasn't just the customer aspect. Personally, I was a victim myself. My information was compromised. But more importantly to me was the fact that my newborn daughter had just received her Social Security number. And my naivete, one of the first things I thought was, my gosh, this breach is going to impact her. Fortunately, it didn't, but I was worried that her data may already be compromised. From a customer perspective and a personal one, my level of trust in Equifax was meaningfully impacted through that incident. But the impacts weren't just felt by the people affected. Equifax itself was meaningfully impacted by this situation. Right out of the gate, you have a 40% loss in your market cap. You have the CEO, the CISO, the CTO, all gone from the organization. And you make an incremental investment of $1.25 billion. And that's a lot of money to invest in technology and security to be able to rebuild the company. And then you have all the scrutiny. We've dealt with a whole host of investigations as a result of the breach itself. One such investigation led me and my CEO to Washington, D.C. in February of last year, to the Dirksen building up there for a congressional testimony for the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. It's a mouthful. You're sitting there at the desk, and there's all these cameras and reporters in front of you, and the way they set these things up is pretty intimidating. You put your right hand up and you swear an oath, and all the senators are sitting there looking down on you. And right out of the gate, the first question I got was, how many certificates were expired in 2017? So clearly they're looking into the past to try to piece together what had happened. And the next question was, what have you done to improve your patching processes? And another one, if you had an effective asset inventory, would you have been able to stop this breach from occurring? So going into more of the speculative piece. Now these questions are all meaningful, and I think they're all fine. I get them from the media, from regulators, insurance underwriters, customers, and so forth. They aren't bad questions, and they're fairly common. But are they the right questions? Are they really getting at the heart of what's going on? To answer that, I want to tell you about an experience I had in my career. Not at Equifax or Home Depot. It goes all the way back to my first job out of college. In 2003, I experienced the greatest crisis I've ever seen in an organization, and it wasn't a breach. I worked at NASA, and it was the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster where we lost 7 lives. In the wake of that event, an investigation was launched to identify the root cause. And the report documented that during the launch process, a piece of foam insulation fell off the external tank. It hit the wing, it damaged it, and then later on upon reentry, because of the damaged wing, excess heat had cascaded throughout the shuttle and disintegrated it. It was terrible. And it was all documented in the report in very specific detail. But there's also one very, very important conclusion in there that made me think that it's extremely relevant to everything that we're talking about today. They said that at NASA, an accident was inevitable. Inevitable. Why was it inevitable? Because organizational structure and decision processes were such that an accident was going to happen, no matter what. And to me, that speaks to the culture of the organization itself. It doesn't speak to the specific controls. It speaks to the specific culture itself. So I think if we look at the cybersecurity landscape and the breaches that we see today, if we focus just on individual controls or elements that fail, I think we're missing the bigger picture. We're missing the root cause, and that root cause is culture. A few months ago, I was talking to a CEO of a major financial institution, and he said, I'm not a technical guy, Jamil. How am I going to know if I have an effective security organization? And I think it's a great question. I told him I think that there's 5 things that really determine whether you have a successful security organization or not. So here are those 5 things. The first one is the head of your security organization, your CISO, positioned within the organization so that they have the ability to influence the entire enterprise? The CISO needs to have the authority to be able to drive change throughout the company. If it's just the security team that's driving security, then you're bound to fail. The second one is, does the head of security have regular interaction and communications with the board of directors? I think this is essential because you need to be able to communicate to those what the key risks are to those organizational stakeholders. Otherwise, they're going to get buried. They're going to get buried, and they're not going to get addressed to the degree that they should be. The third one's about incentives. Are there company-wide financial incentives tied to security performance? There's a lot of organizations out there that just check the box about security. Either they have nothing or what they do have is a little blurb in their annual review process about security, but it doesn't really tie to anything meaningful. The organizations that are doing this really well are the ones that have aligned security with the financial incentives for performance. Just like almost all organizations do as it relates to the top line growth or your bottom line or your margins or your market share, if the financial incentives tied to the performance of your security program or any program where you're trying to drive a lasting transformation, it puts you in a far better position. The next one is crisis management. Are you doing consistent crisis management exercises with the executive leadership team and the board of directors? If you're not, what it tells me is that you don't think a breach is ever going to happen. In the morning, I put on a seatbelt every time I get into my car to drive to work because I know it's possible that I'm going to get into an accident. And I want to do at least the very minimum amount to be able to protect myself. If your organization isn't doing crisis management exercises, then you fundamentally believe that it's probably not going to happen to you. And as we know, certainly nowadays, it can happen to anyone at any time. And the final one ties back to risk management. Has your organization ever halted or delayed a critical enterprise initiative because of security or privacy? If you've done this, then you have the right governance processes in place to be able to identify significant risks and escalate them. And it means that your management, the CEO, the leadership team, the board, has the conviction to do something about it. They have the conviction to not take advantage of an immediate short-term opportunity that may give an incremental dollar of revenue, and instead focus on doing the right thing and focusing the organization on risk. Now, about your organizations. Do you check the box on all 5 of these things? It's likely that you don't, because they aren't common parts of the organization today. My argument is that if you have all 5 of those checked, though, then even a mediocre security team can have a far better chance of success. You can have the best security team in the world, best security team ever. But if you don't have these 5 things in place, the likelihood that they're going to be successful as a team is probably pretty low. If you look at the studies today, most will tell you that one of the top 3 things that any board of directors or CEOs care about is cybersecurity. With all of the geopolitical risks, the competitive advantage issues, the labor challenges, cybersecurity is consistently still one of the top 3 things that boards are worried about. So everyone says that it's really important, but what really matters to me is what you're going to do about it. So what are you going to do about these potential risks? I think it's easy to talk. It's easy to say cyber keeps me up at night or privacy keeps me up at night, but actually doing something about it takes effort. And as a result, what we're seeing, I think, is a lot of people talking about the right things, but not actually doing much about them. At Equifax, we have a new saying, which is say do. And it comes from our CEO when he started just shortly after I did, post-breach. And say do, I think, is absolutely essential. If we say something, we've got to deliver on it. And it's not specific to security. It's anywhere that you want to drive lasting change. It's that level of action that I think drives the meaningful level of progress that we've seen at Equifax. And I think if more companies chose that mindset, we wouldn't necessarily be in the same position that we are today. Collectively, we'll be at a much better spot to drive long-term transformation, whether that's improving how we defend against cyber attackers or making another long-term lasting change within the organization on the business side. In our increasingly digitized world, it's only going to get harder for us as defenders to be successful. Every organization is critically reliant on technology. Technology underpins more and more of what we do in our organizations. And technology is inherently insecure. You can have something that has 0 weaknesses today, and I guarantee you that tomorrow it will have something wrong with it. There will be risk. Couple that with the reliance on data that we have, and you have a perfect storm of, reliance on technology, massive amounts of data being created, and so we become infinitely more attractive targets to the bad guys, all of us. And then you marry up a new dynamic, privacy, something that consumers in general have been pretty apathetic about for quite some time now, but are now starting to really, really care about it and engage. And as a result, you have regulators coming in to drive that as well. It's a confluence of factors that are converging to make security more important now than it ever has been before. So it's only going to continue to get harder for us to be successful. And we need to join together if we're going to be able to win. I'm going to tell you a story that really changed how I think about this. So I used to be the CISO of Los Alamos National Laboratory. If you don't know, Los Alamos is a nuclear weapons institution, so the best of the best attackers out there came after us. One day we got hit, and the adversary was able to penetrate the perimeter. And in that environment, you don't just cut them off and call it a day like you do in the private sector. You sit there and you watch them and you monitor them. And you pick up as much information as you can and grab their malware, things like that. So we did that for a while until eventually they got too far into the environment, and we cut them off. Cool, end of the day. But then the next morning, I got a call from a peer of mine in a different laboratory. Dude, we got hit hard. Can you send some of your folks over here to help us out, is what he was telling me. So I said, of course, yeah, sure. I'll send some people over. And I did. And the attack turned out to be so bad that they actually had to pull the plug on the internet for 2 full weeks. 2 weeks of the entire laboratory being out. But that's not the most interesting part. I think the interesting part of this is when we did the retrospective after the fact, what we found out was that both organizations got hit at the exact same time by the same threat actor. And as soon as we blocked them on our side, the attacker redirected all of those resources and amplified the attack on the other lab. So, now you've heard about this outrunning the bear concept. If you're out in the woods and you run into a bear, as long as you can run faster than the next guy, the bear's going to eat him and not you. This is the first time in my career but I'd actually seen direct evidence supporting that notion, that cybersecurity, like it applied to cybersecurity too. It was a perfect example. My lab had outrun the bear, and it had gotten the other guy. So I was so committed to this concept, outrun the bear, it even became a strategy for me at my next company. Our whole goal was to be better than our peers, so they would get attacked and we'd be safe. We even had a little stuffed bear that I used. I used to hand it out to the top performers on the team every single month. I mean, that's how invested I was in that strategy. But I've learned over the years that I was looking at it the wrong way. You know, that strategy is a bad one. It's bad. And it doesn't work in the long run. And here's why. As soon as my buddy gets eaten in the woods, that bear is going to come after me. And then I'm going to be all by myself. You know, I had looked at a certain set of outcomes and a certain set of data points, and I concluded that we had been successful because the other lab got hit harder. What I didn't realize at the time was that neither one of us won. You know, the other lab getting hit was hard on me too. In reality, we both had disruptions because of this attack. We both ended up losing. We know that attackers use what they learn and the resources they get from their attacks to get better and better, so that when they do come back, the attacks are worse. Far more impactful. The lesson here, though, is why I think it's so critical that we all work together to raise the bar for organizations. Let's be honest. Does it really benefit anyone when we have breaches like the ones that happen at Equifax or at Marriott or Capital One or any of those other firms? It doesn't help anybody except for the attackers. In this industry, we tend to focus only on the bad. They should have had this control in place or that control in place, whatever. What we should be doing is be working more closely with each other. One of the tenets of the strategy at Equifax is that we all need to be in this together. We really do believe that when it comes to security, there are no trade secrets. Not a single one of us can survive an attack like that without the help from others. And if we work together on a consistent basis, I think we have a fighting chance to be able to defend against attackers. And with that, I want to close on what I think is the most important part of this entire talk. Trust starts and ends with you. In my career, I've worked in a lot of places and with a lot of people. And when we're focused on security, or any other really difficult challenge, to be honest, we can be Pollyanna. Everything is fine, it's going to work out. Or we can be the boy who cries wolf and escalate everything possible until it all becomes noise. No one listens to us anymore because we're saying that everything is a problem. That's tempting sometimes because there's a lot of vulnerabilities out there. We have a lot of risks. Or we can look inside ourselves and ask, am I embodying the attributes of the culture that I want to build? And then do that day in and day out. If we push for the kind of culture that we want, we start within ourselves, fight tooth and nail every single day to make incremental progress, I think we have a meaningful shot at being able to turn the tide on what we're facing today. And if we do that, not only do I think that we're going to be successful, but I think all of us collectively have the opportunity to truly excel.
Jamil, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. We're looking forward to taking the audience questions. If you have a question, please go up to the question box on the upper right-hand side of your console and send us your question. We can't wait to hear from you, and we will be live in just a few seconds. So let's answer some audience questions. We had a question that came in on asking you to talk a little bit more around partnerships, sort of what does that actually look like? And, how do we make that happen within our organizations?
Sure. Thank you for the questions and the opportunity today. Hopefully, just to go back real quick, hopefully the talk was useful. When we decided to do this, I thought it'd be more useful to be able to have questions and have a Q&A and start a dialogue. I think that's going to be more constructive, so hopefully that works for you all. As it relates to this particular question, I think partnerships are one of the most important aspects in cybersecurity today, and it's critical because there's no singular organization that can defend against all of the threats that are out there. I mean, for example, we can invest $1.5 billion at Equifax to bolster our security and make us best in class. But even that by itself isn't going to allow us to be able to effectively defend against, a targeted nation-state attack. Like we won't be able to effectively stop the PLA if they come hit us consistently if we do not have partnerships. And so when I speak about that, I'm talking about building coalitions amongst other organizations, peer groups, and so forth to be able to share best practices, threat intelligence, even things like hiring recommendations are extraordinarily useful to be able to build out your team and ensure you have the right talents in place to have a sustainable, optimized program. And then as it relates to breach support, it's also a very critical facet. And this is where you kind of expand out. Obviously, it's useful to be able to have strong partners across the spectrum to be able to help defend against those things. But once they actually hit, you really have to have strong relationships with legal firms, with communications, insurers across the board to ensure that you've got all of the right practices in place to be able to effectively respond when something like that may or may not occur. And then I think the FBI was huge in our case at Equifax. We got engaged with them well before the breach and had a strong partnership. But as soon as we identified it, we communicated with them and got them ingrained into the program so that we could help to the best degree possible with their investigation by providing them information. And I think that if we hadn't had that relationship up front, it would have been far more difficult for us to ultimately arrive where we did this past January when the FBI was able to issue the indictment against the Chinese PLA members that executed that attack against us. So whether it's the FBI or the Secret Service, these federal authorities are very useful to build in partnerships and relationships with up front. And then if you go beyond that even, there's a variety of other groups out there, depending on what your specific focus area should be, that is also useful. So we joined early on, we joined the Better Identity Coalition to be able to help support strong authentication and identities in cyberspace. We established a partnership with the World Economic Forum. We're a global firm at Equifax, and so being able to have that broad-based global view to help advance security and also get best practices and learnings from other organizations and leaders throughout the space is extraordinarily useful for us. And then I think the other part of the equation is really your vendors and third parties and bringing them to bear. So, I mean, as it relates to the breach specifically, I mean, we used a variety of third parties to help us go through that process, whether it's Mandiant on the forensic side, various legal firms to help us there. And I think that even Equifax itself is an organization that can materially help in this space where we have solutions to be able to help with credit monitoring, dark web, internet scanning, communications for notification letters, call center support, and things like that. It's not plugging Equifax per se, but I think it's a necessary and very useful aspect in the breach response to be able to have partners on your side to help you through it. Because I can tell you firsthand, it is one of the most tumultuous and stressful situations and tends to be, in many cases, a watershed moment for organizations. And when you're in the midst of a crisis, you need to have all of your plans in place and these partners established ahead of time to be able to get through the challenge as quickly and as effectively as possible.
So I think I'd like to pick up on that last bit where you're talking about sort of those partnerships, and I think it feeds into, we received a flurry of questions when you began to talk about the root cause behind control failures that lead to breaches. And culture seems to be so much a part of determining, whether those go well or whether they don't. So I think from that, I'd also like to ask you, how do you fix culture, and then how do you support and monitor a healthy culture once you've sort of put it into place to make sure that it's, still there when you have those times of crises?
I think it's an excellent question, and I would argue that it's certainly useful in a time of crisis. There's no question about that. But I think that it goes beyond that, because I think if you have a strong culture, it puts you in the best position possible to avoid that crisis altogether. And I think that at least if you speak to many of my peers who tend to be pretty technical as CISOs, that's ordinarily how we come up through the ranks, is we're an engineer or computer science space, and then we migrate up to where we are today. We tend to look at things, tend to look at problems from the lens of technology and how technology can solve everything. I throughout my career, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't start off in this space feeling the exact same way, but over time I've gravitated to really, really rely on culture, and I believe that it is the most important facet of success, because at the end of the day, if you don't have the right level of support, if everyone in the organization isn't viewing security as a responsibility of their own, if they're just pointing at security as the end-all, be-all, and the responsible party for ensuring protection, then you're going to fail. And I think CISOs will fail if they haven't been able to articulate it correctly. And so we did a variety of things on the Equifax side right from the start. I mean, culture was the number one emphasis for us. And one of the things we did is that we first changed the reporting line of the CISOs, such that my role reports directly to the CEO, giving us the right level of authority to be able to drive change throughout the environment. We established a dotted line reporting relationship between the CISO and the board of directors. We implemented compensation incentives. So, look, most people go to work to get paid, and financial incentives tend to be one of the stronger mechanisms organizations can bring to bear to change behavior. And so what we did is we established a security measure for every bonus-eligible employee throughout the entire company that's tied directly to our security goals and the transformation that we were driving, such that if we didn't meet it, then there would be a material haircut off of every single person's bonus, not just people in security, not just people in technology, but the entire company. And so building in these kinds of measures really helps to turn the tide. And then if you marry it up with other specific employee-based measures or controls, such as our employee scorecard, which gives everyone real-time visibility into their security behaviors, like clicking on emails and reporting security incidents and taking their training on time. These things all collectively work to build in a fabric that helps you to embed security into the DNA of the firm as a whole. And as a result, what you get is an organization that's much more cognizant of the threats, much more aware of the potential risks that they generate on a day-to-day basis, and it aligns everyone so that they're working toward one common goal, which is to ensure that we're managing risk appropriately and we're positioning ourselves in the best way possible to defend against the threats.
And Jamil, what is the sort of relationship with the board? I think that's a big concern for a lot of people in the audience, whether they're within the C-suite themselves interacting with the board, whether they're further down the chain, and how do they make sure that the board is understanding their security concerns. And then conversely, a lot of people in the audience are either on the legal side, sort of doing consulting, or are on the carrier side, trying to figure out what the board looks at and how their attention is focused or not on these security issues. So, you're a member of senior management. How do you approach the board? How does Equifax itself sort of structure that? And, how do you approach educating them and, really getting their buy-in and really just their focus in making those decisions around cybersecurity?
Yeah. The first step, and this is a challenge I hear from my peers all the time, is getting an audience with the board and getting a consistent one at that. So if you're only, speaking to the board once a year for 10 minutes, then it's pretty difficult to be able to drive any change. And that speaks back to the culture question you asked me earlier. If you don't have an audience with them, then something's wrong and ineffective about the culture of the organization as a whole. But assuming you have a level of visibility with them, I think the challenge actually is twofold. I think first, because CISOs tend to be more technical and because we tend to get into the weeds, we struggle to communicate risk in a consumable way for non-technical people. And so oftentimes we're our own worst enemy, is that we dive into the nitty-gritty and we lose someone when we talk about an IDOR attack or cross-site scripting or some asset that's leveraging an insecure protocol or something like that, and you lose everyone, and then it's a wasted effort. On the other hand, though, boards also need to be able to step up. Technology, if you look at the data, I saw a stat the other day, 80% of firms in the Fortune 500 now have view themselves as technology firms. And if that's the case, then you need to have some meaningful level of technical aptitude on your board of directors. It can't just be people that are just starting to use email or don't have any level of visibility into it. And so we need to be met both ways. We need to do better on the communication side with security, and the board needs to pick up more on the technology aptitude side as well. Once that's done, then as CISOs, we have two critical pieces. And one of the things that I try to do whenever I meet with the board is always use it as an opportunity to help train them up. Because I don't expect them to all be, deep security experts. And so I need to be able to leverage my opportunities in front of them to help teach them and guide them about what security is all about, what are the things that really, really matter, and frame them in a way that is consumable to them. And then the second thing I try to do is really emphasize priority. In security, there are just countless issues every single day, and we, granted, view the world through the lens of skepticism and issues, because this is part of our job, is just finding problems. And one of the things that we can oftentimes do a poor job of is prioritizing them and figuring out which are the really, truly most important strategic challenges that we're facing, and frame it in business terms so that they can be understood and accepted by the board of directors. And I think it all boils down to being good communicators of broad-based risk. I think if you're able to solve for that and do it in a cogent way and then teach them along that path, then you're going to land in a strong position, because the more they learn, the more interested they're going to be in something. That's just a natural human trait. And you'll get to a position where they have better visibility, and therefore they're going to provide you more support and airtime to be able to help you drive your agenda forward.
And so how do you keep that fresh? I mean, we've obviously seen a lot of new security issues just arise from COVID. Are those new scenarios that you put to them, in those meetings? How do you kind of keep it fresh and get them, kind of shake any kind of complacency, even those that do understand sort of the security, at least that you have in place, just to try to make sure that you're, staying ahead of the curve?
I don't think it should be particularly difficult in this day and age to keep things fresh, because one of the draws for me and why I got into security to begin with is because it's so dynamic, because things change constantly. I mean, whether you're dealing with a nation state threat actor who's doing a denial of service attack on you, or you're trying to effectively secure your entire workforce as they all migrate to work from home. There's something, or there's a third-party breach, and you need to be able to highlight what controls you have in place to be able to mitigate a similar type of attack if it were to be targeted at you. There's a lot of material out there that I think that can keep it fresh. But the key, I think, going back to my previous point, is really emphasizing and doing it in a prioritized way. You can't just bring something brand new every single time to the board, because then it just gets jumbled and lost in the bigger picture. And so we need to move out of that sort of tactical space and frame everything around what the broader strategic goals are, and then use those day-to-day, week-to-week examples that we all see all the time as evidence of and supporting evidence of what we're trying to ultimately accomplish.
So we've gotten quite a lot of questions that are getting a little bit more granular in security protocols and sort of some of your thoughts on that. Before we get into some of the nitty-gritty, I'd like to just sort of talk a little bit about how you view the tension between security and privacy. We can't have perfect one or the other often. So how do you approach that? What have been some of the challenges that you've experienced in your different companies, and sort of what is your current philosophy around that?
First off, I don't think that we'll ever reach any level of perfection in either one of those areas. Let me be clear about that. But I've never subscribed to the notion that security and privacy are mutually exclusive. Like there are very few cases, and they're extreme corner cases, quite frankly, that would disallow me from protecting someone's PII without having to know it, or with having to know it at the same time. Like it's just not the case. One of the things that I think that we did at Equifax that was novel and I think has been borne us a lot of positive outcomes is we married up privacy and security. And so we have one unified organization that ties those in. So the chief privacy officer reports into me, and so we're able to design our security controls in such a way that they marry up to meet our privacy requirements and obligations as well. And I think if you look at NIST CSF, the cybersecurity framework, for example, and then you look at NIST PF, the new privacy framework that NIST has developed, if you look at the controls across each one of those two areas, the level of duplicity between them is quite astounding. And it actually supports exactly what we did, which is align security and privacy, because the delta of those two is just a handful of controls. And it speaks to the fact that they are so intertwined that you can't have good privacy without leveraging a lot of these same controls that we use in security to be able to protect the organization. So I think that's a very critical factor. And one of the things I've seen in the past is that when you look at privacy, oftentimes it tends to be more of a administrative kind of legalese function, when in fact, when it gets down to it, your ability to be able to execute on many of those privacy requirements are contingent on having the right technologies in place and having those right defensive measures implemented within the environment so that you can actually execute them. And so I found it to be highly effective as an organization. And I think that it prepares us and it's positioned us to be able to achieve things like GDPR and CCPA without a great deal of challenge internally while still meeting those requirements. The last piece I would say on that is that I think that the bigger challenge as it relates to privacy is the fact that we still to date don't have a unified privacy law. And it's a struggle because, when you have any types of events or incidents, it forces us to go through and spend an inordinate amount of time trying to determine what are the actual requirements on a state-by-state basis or country-by-country basis for what are the reporting requirements and what are the actual controls that we should have in place for them. And when you're in the midst of an incident or an event, it just becomes extraordinarily difficult to be able, and it's a waste of time, in my opinion, to spend that time on that when we could have one unified approach that allows all organizations to work from the same playbook in a far more effective fashion. So I think that's the biggest challenge right now. And I have seen organizations more and more as of late start to marry up security and privacy so that we've done our part. We just need some assistance at the government level to help push this thing through.
Well, I think you'd get a lot of applause if this was a live audience, for sure. I think the community definitely struggles with, just trying to collaborate between jurisdictions, both, within the U.S. and globally. It's definitely a huge issue for them. We've gotten a couple of questions. I'm just going to push out one, but they really want to hear about basically the steps organizations should be taking to protect their environments. Obviously, Equifax has, a big budget, but we're also getting a couple of questions about what you recommend as sort of the minimum set of controls that are important to have in place. And if you could maybe talk a little bit about the difference that maybe a very large organization like Equifax, the resources that you have at your disposal, but what you can do if you're a much smaller company or you're trying to provide cyber insurance, for instance, for a small company. So I'm going to push one out, but I do recognize the audience. You had a bunch, so thank you.
It's a great question. And there's no doubt that there are haves and have-nots in this space as it relates to the budget that you can apply towards security. But I think the silver lining here, the good news, is that in my experience, if you're able to just implement and focus on the foundational controls, you don't need, the super fancy AI or ML or any of this other stuff that's out there nowadays to actually effectively secure yourself. You need to just do the basics well. Strong access controls. Make sure that you have your data protected from whether it's at rest or it's in transit. Like just these basic controls will stop 99.9% of the attacks out there. And I think on the other benefit of it is if you implement those basic controls and you operate them effectively. I'm a big college football fan, and while I went to undergrad at Oklahoma, so I'm a Sooner, I've got to give kudos to Nick Saban over in Alabama because the approach he's taken to his football team is the same one I believe that we need to do a better job of across different security organizations, which is focus on the basic blocking and tackling. It's not sexy at all. I get it. And when I talk to my peers, people, sometimes shrug because they're like, oh, well, what about this new cool tool that we can talk about? But it's just the basic things that actually truly drive the change. And then once you get that, then sure, if you have the resources, you can bolster it with other more modern tools and so forth. But for the most part, if you look at the ecosystem today, most organizations do not do a very good job at the basic things. And if you look at most of the breaches, I think there was 6,000 reported breaches last year alone. If you look at the analysis on them, the root cause for most of them are pretty basic control failures, right? You didn't patch your system, or you didn't have your certificates updated, or you didn't have an asset inventory to be able to even know what assets you were trying to protect. These are pretty basic fundamental things that don't come with a massive cost necessarily. And so I think it gives hope for a lot of the SMEs out there because you don't need to have a massive budget to be able to protect your environment, at least within a reasonable level. It really just takes a leader and a team to focus on doing the basics really, really well every single day.
And so we've gotten a couple of questions as well around really specific things for you to address and sort of in your role as a CISO. So the first I'm going to put up is a question about whether or not you use IS controls and maturity models when looking at your security.
Yeah, we do. We use a variety of measures to be able to effectively determine where we stand as an organization. I have really liked maturity for at least since my visa days, 10 years ago, I guess. And I remember when we first rolled that out, we had a maturity assessment. They did it based on the NIST control framework, 853. And I remember it was a big win because the board absolutely loved it. You go through, you do the assessment, you come up with a score of 0 through 5 based on your maturity, and then you can aggregate that up. It's very simple, and then you can benchmark it, and so you can show the board, hey, here's where we stand relative to other players within the space. And anyone, whether you're technical or not, can understand a chart that shows where you are on a 5-point scale relative to other players. So it was a big win. And I remember my boss at the time, he was like, Jamil, this is great, but do you think this works long term? Like, is this, or if you have a very mature risk organization and can present based on the actual risks that each given organization has, this sort of becomes moot. It's not as useful as it is today. And my answer to him at the time, and I got lucky because I think I was right about it, is that they both are extraordinarily valuable. The maturity tells you how prepared and effective your program is at being able to manage risks. Risk is different. Risk highlights the areas the areas and the level of risk that you're taking on. And so the risk piece helps you to prioritize where you want to drive further improvements within your program. But the maturity piece looks forward, in my opinion. It's a much more forward-looking measure than the risk one, which is far more backward looking. And so I think they complement each other really well. And so if you can have both, it's by far the best situation to have. But in addition to that, I tend to be a very maniacal as it comes to measures. I also like to get other data points. I don't want to use just the maturity measure. And so at Equifax, for example, we do annual maturity assessment across all of our controls globally. We get our score, we do that. But in addition to that, I want to also measure things like our third-party risk. So we use organizations like BitSight and Security Scorecard, choose whichever one that's out there that you want, to be able to give us a view into the maturity from an outside-in view. We use them for our third parties, but I also use them to see what my score is for my organization based on their same modeling criteria, which is a useful data point. And if that score marries up with my maturity score, then I know that my assessor and that my security posture is what it is. And then we also marry up our ESG scores, which is slightly different, but it also helps to point to where we actually are and paint the picture of the health of the organization at large. And I think using a variety of these independent data sources to be able to build out the narrative and frame the picture of where the organization stands is a really, really strong way to not just communicate with the board, but to make effective, meaningful decisions about where you should invest every incremental dollar of spend that you have as a security organization itself.
And can you, because we have a big insurance audience here too, can you tell me whether or not sort of cyber insurance is part of your overall risk management strategy, and maybe talk a little bit about how that decision's made and sort of who's part of making that decision?
It is, without a doubt, it is, and I think it is for most organizations in this day and age. I mean, look, when it comes to risk, you're basically making a decision based on you're going to arrive at three different potential conclusions for, right? One is either you're going to accept the risk, two is you're going to remediate the risk, or three, you're going to transfer it. And insurance is obviously a meaningful way to be able to transfer that risk. Now, I think if you would have asked me earlier in my career, I would have said, hey, I think for a lot of small to medium-sized businesses, maybe if you don't have the budget, maybe the path you want to take is for just going with the risk transfer because you don't have the ability to be able to manage it. But that was back in the day when I don't think that insurers did a great job of actually measuring risk effectively. And so it didn't really matter what your underlying security posture was. Your rates were going to be roughly the same no matter what. But as the industry has improved and they're better at being able to identify control effectiveness and what components actually make a healthy security organization, so there's better risk-based decisions into the pricing of the insurance premiums that you're procuring, that's not necessarily the case anymore, which is why I emphasize foundational controls, get those in place, and then certainly you want to use insurance as another mechanism, as an overlay on top of that for some level of risk transfer. Those decisions should be made between the security team, legal, and your executive leadership group, I think, at any organization, because ultimately it's a business-based decision in terms of the cost and how much risk one is willing to accept, because there's obviously a variety of different plans that you can potentially pursue to provide yourself different levels of coverage in the event of a cyber breach.
Yeah. So let's shift gears for a little bit. I got a question in that wanted to kind of explore your experience in looking at the motivations of threat actors. And, I think maybe the way to look at this is if you could talk a little bit about the differences between what you saw during your time at Home Depot as compared to now at Equifax. And, what is your approach to managing cybersecurity and protecting against sort of the different kinds of threat actors in your current role as opposed to, what it was in Home Depot? And I think not just getting at the different nature of the organizations, but really the evolution of threats that are existing for companies, globally.
this is really important and often overlooked component of leading a security program. I think because of all the headlines out there and all the breaches and talk about nation states, that people tend to take a, I don't want to call it lazy, but sort of an ambiguous approach to defining what controls that one wants to bring to bear. But at the end of the day, it really needs to tie back to what the threat actually is. And one of the first things I would suggest any organization do is understand what that landscape looks like. So when you look at, like you said, I'll use Home Depot and Equifax as an example. Home Depot is a major retailer, and we obviously have threat actors that target the organization, as evidenced by the fact that the company was breached in 2015. But the profile is completely different than that of Equifax. The data sensitivity, the volume is at Home Depot is not the same as it is at Equifax. The threat actors and their motivations are going to be different as they target Home Depot versus Equifax. And so, like at Home Depot, we were predominantly focused on organized crime. These crime syndicates, whether it's in the cyber side or if it's fraud, that's what they want from Home Depot, because there isn't a great deal of value in the for a nation state to target a Home Depot. But if you look at Equifax, on the other hand, we have completely different organization. We have a completely different business model. The sensitivity and volume of the data that we have is different, and so it opens the aperture from a threat actor standpoint. Not only are we potentially at risk from attacks from hacktivists and sort of ideologues, but we're also meaningful targets for organized crime as well, because you can certainly monetize the information that one could gather from Equifax in a nefarious way. But then, just as importantly, nation states are a critical factor for us. I mean, it's been proven now after the indictment of the Chinese PLA because of our breach in 2017. But it's not a stretch to think that there is the type of data that we have and the type of business that we're in provides an economic or defensive advantage to nation states out there. And so we need to take the different tools, tactics, procedures, motivations of these threat actors into account when we design our control strategies to be able to protect our environment. And I think that's why you see oftentimes, whether it's conscious or not, you'll see more investment in security, and you'll see more maturity in security in certain industries, like financial services, for example, versus, say, manufacturing or retail even, where historically they hadn't seen those things. Now, I think that the ecosystem has changed and the motives have changed, as we've seen as of late, with nation states targeting a lot of these organizations that people traditionally didn't believe were of value to them, trying to build that constellation of data around individuals for defense or economic advantage. But all of those things need to be taken into account when you're designing your program. And without it, you're going to miss the mark, either undershoot or overshoot as it relates to the security of your organization.
So we in the industry and many net diligence events, the conversation is always around it. It's not if, but when. But we've seen this evolution over the last couple of years where you'd have a breach and nobody wanted to talk about it. You'd be outed by Brian Krebs and you'd hang your head in shame. And we've gotten to a place, I think, where literally, pretty much everybody, even Equifax, has been breached. And so, we talk about communications and transparency around these incidents and public perception and how to sort of control the message and be either a leader in this and sort of be open or sort of still try to kind of keep it to us. So obviously we're here today, and I know that you've given, other talks on this. And I'd like to hear a little bit just about the process that you and Equifax as a whole went through in determining how to talk about this openly and where and when. And, again, we really appreciate you being here today and giving your insights. But what went into that process, and what advice would you have for other companies who suffer a breach and are trying to figure out from a client interfacing way, from an employee interfacing way, how to talk about it and how to proceed through it from a communication standpoint.
Yeah, the key piece here is understanding that every business is different. I know people say this and so forth, but there, even within the same industry, there are a variety of nuances between organizations. And it somewhat speaks to my previous point about the different threat actors and stuff like that. But you have to take all of these things into account when you're designing the solution for and your strategy for security. That if you look, I'll use the same two examples I was using from before with Home Depot and Equifax. If you look at what we were facing after the Home Depot breach, and if you look at the Home Depot business model relative to Equifax, they're completely different. And when we went through the decision at Home Depot, look, my CEO, Craig, was like, Jamil, we cannot ever let this happen again. The board, as committed as one could ever be to ensuring that we had all of the right defenses in place to disallow another breach of that type. That's all great. And I think many organizations take that same approach. Hey, if it happens, you gain religion pretty quick because you see what the ramifications are. In many cases, people lose their jobs and there's an amount of turmoil. So you get religion pretty quick there. But the nuance comes with what's the approach you're going to take. And at Home Depot, we decided, look, if you look at our business model, if you look at who was affected by this breach, if you look at the threat actors out there, we don't ever view security as necessarily becoming a competitive advantage for us in the marketplace. It's just not going to happen. No one's going to say, hey, I'm going to go to Home Depot versus going to Lowe's because they have a great security program. And so what we decided based on that was, look, we're going to make all the investments. We're going to be best in class. But we're just going to put our heads down and make it happen. We don't need to have any fanfare around this. Equifax is different. Equifax is different because we have a completely different business model. Because security and trust are actually core to the business itself and to our brand. And along came our CEO, who has a view that security isn't a trade secret. Security will never be a trade secret. And because of that, we said, look, we are the seminal breach out there. There may be ones with more records. There may be ones that lasted longer or whatever. But ultimately, the amount of sensitive data and the volume of it and the scrutiny that was generated as a result of it, we are that breach. And we could take two approaches. We can put our heads down and grind it out and become a leader in our own right, or we can help to build the community at large and be as transparent as possible to help others defend against and avoid the same type of scenario. And we chose the latter. And the reason we did that is because we felt that to truly become a leader, we can't just help ourselves. We can't just make that $1.5 billion investment and have all the latest fancy tools and improve our processes and move all of our assets and workloads into the cloud. We needed to really make a difference. We needed to get out there and help other companies and the industry at large be better prepared for breaches so that they could potentially avoid them as well. And so we made that conscious decision up front, partially because it ties into the business and because it was, trust and security are critical to our long-term success, but also partially because we knew that if we did it right, given all that we had learned, that we could really make a difference on a global scale and help avoid even, one or two or three other organizations having to deal with the same type of thing. And I think if you look at the results, certainly anecdotally, based on the number of calls I get from folks and advice people are asking about, I think we've done a good job of that so far. And I think that we've helped position organizations to be better prepared for the eventual attack and the potential breach out there, whether it's from a crisis management improvement standpoint, providing best practices. I even do a CISO call with around 300 to 500 other peers of mine where we walk through our project plans for the tools and so forth that we're implementing and share information about our new initiatives like assurance and things like that, which really helps to get them engaged, help them learn from us, and I think make us all better for it.
And I'll include in that even coming to Net Diligence and sharing it with our audience. So we really appreciate you being here today, Jamil, and I want to thank the Equifax team that helped put this together, and for the audience for tuning in. This program will be available on demand shortly via our website, and we welcome you at future events. Jamil, thank you again so very much for being here today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yep. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.